Welcome to the third week of the From Linear to Circular Open for All program. My name is Seb, and I'm part of the learning team here at the MacArthur Foundation, if you don't know me already. Once again, I'm joined by Ilma. Ilma, before you say anything, I just want to say I think you've done a really good job over these first 2 weeks.
As in all the participants?
Well, I actually meant you specifically, but also great job to all the participants as well.
Well said. Thank you. I think you have done a very great job yourself. And indeed, I think a lot of our participants have been super active, especially on the Slack channel. And it has been extremely exciting to see all the engagement and the depth of some of the discussions that have been happening there.
It's really enriching to see people feeding back on each other's ideas, to be really trying to push the concept forward along with us. You're definitely not a crowd who's just taking from this program. You're really adding to it and putting in as well.
And indeed, we want to encourage you to continue conversing with each other, because there are so many of you. Sometimes it's not even possible for us to actually physically read through everything that's there. But if you spot something that is interesting and if you have something to say about that, please connect. And we see that you're already doing that. So that's just great.
Super.
So today we will be speaking about business models and case studies and all things related to business. How can we speak about circular economy to businesses? And as Seb mentioned earlier, we will be joined by a great colleague of ours. But before we get into that, there are a couple of important announcements we would like to make. And I guess I'm sharing my screen, right? So
that would be great.
Yeah. So right now, you should be able to see a couple of links on your screen. So first of all, I know that there are a lot of questions coming up in terms of how to get most of this program, and the best place to find all of your answers is to go to our Slack community, and you can see the link in the screen right now. So write it down, copy paste it, make a screenshot of it, and join the Slack community. And then once you're there, the best place to start is to find a channel that's called get_info. And it's the right place to ask any questions. And also there's pinned items like guidelines PDF, and it will tell you all you need to know about the Slack community. And likewise, there is a LinkedIn community that you can join as well, and you can see the link to it on the screen right now. So copy paste it, and we will bring back the links at the end of the webinar as well. And one more very important piece of information. So knowing how many of you were interested in both themes, both topics for the double webinar weeks. So in week 5, you were supposed to choose between plastics and cities. And on week 6, you were supposed to choose between fashion and food. And due to popular demand, we decided to give you both webinars each week. So you will be able to get all 4 instead of just 2. So the plastics will happen at the regular time on Wednesday, 13th of May, which is 4 p.m. British Summer Time, happening right as it is right now. Cities will happen the same week, Friday, 15th of May, at the same time, 4 p.m. British Summer Time. Next week, week 6, we will have fashion on 20th of May, which is the regular Wednesday time. And we're working very hard to confirm the time for food, and we will get back to you on that as soon as possible. So we will be repeating that information later on. We will be communicating that in the next webinar and also on Slack. So for now, if you have any further questions, please just hold on. Don't send emails. You can ask about them on Slack, and we will be continuously communicating, so you'll receive everything that you need to know. Right, back to you, Seb.
Great to see everyone tuning in on the chat and you know, saying how excited they are about this phase. I have to give a shout out to Rocchio. He's in Australia. It's 1 a.m. You are the hardcore star of this week. We did ask you last week, I don't know if you can flip the slide over, Elma. We did ask you last week about to do some system mapping, or rather Joe Isles, who was the presenter last week, asked you to do some system mapping, a little bit of homework. I've taken some really good screenshots of this and put them on this slide.
Really hard
but it was so great to see how many people responded to that. There was loads of great. I also really appreciated how many people were responding to each other's designs, pointing out different ideas. And I think that's, you know, so much value from participating in the homework. I've tried to comment on as many as I can, and I will continue to do so. It's not too late to do this. It's the exercise is written out in the homework channel on Slack. So all the links you need, all the information you need is available. I think as general feedback, these are some good examples. We've got buildings here, we've got curtains, we've got shoes. A lot of people drew a system with one loop. So the sort of idea of literally taking a line and turning it into a circle. I think if you want to push yourselves even further, by the way, these are much better looking and more visible on the Slack channel. So do check them out after the session if you haven't seen them already. Adding multiple loops, adding multiple value creation mechanisms is a way of pushing your thinking even further, rather than just thinking about how do we go from having a shoe that becomes waste to just bending that into one circle. That's the added layer of complexity that and where some of the really richest opportunities in the circular economy exist. The other thing I think about is, the value of doing this exercise is the kind of thought experiment piece, the kind of testing your brain out and exercising that system thinking muscle. And perhaps in some cases, people were very passionate about the products they were talking about and very like keen to be able to get to that point where they're showing a solution, and they did a good job. But there's also an element of how do you really think about everything that sits around this product and think about it systemically, and that's a skill that takes practice. And so I'd encourage you to keep coming back to these kinds of exercises as you in your world.
And we will follow up on these exercises in a way. So this week's homework will be related to the exercise you did. And also next week, we'll have an amazing speaker and we'll get back into systems thinking and we'll be talking a bit more about that. So before we dive into the topic of today and introduce our guest speaker, a couple of things just about today's webinar and how to get the most of Zoom. So if you have any content related question, please post it in Q&A. So there is a Q&A box and this is where your questions go. And it will be either picked up by our colleagues behind the scenes, or we will bring it live, me and Seb and our guest. And if you have any comments, observations, and you want to continue conversing with each other, you can do it in the chat box. So chat for conversation, questions and Q&A, and please keep it content related. Right. So I have an honor to introduce the speaker today. Maybe he would like to appear right now on our screens.
Do you want to stop sharing the slides as well, Emma,
Yes,
so everyone can see this good-looking man clearly?
Yes, so there are three things we can say about this man. So the first thing is that he goes by two first names. The second one, that is, he's our vlogging star on LinkedIn. And the third fact about this person is that he holds various key business relationships at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So he's just the right person to talk about everything related to business and how circular economy can be applied in businesses and how businesses perceive circular economy. So welcome, James George.
Good afternoon. I think there was a compliment in there somewhere, maybe a little bit backhand, but no, good afternoon. Lovely to be here.
I think that holding the key relationships in businesses.
Okay, the first two were just smoke and mirrors.
Even a vlogging star. Right.
How you guys doing?
Yeah, it's an exciting topic. I'm excited about today.
Hope so.
Seb?
I'm looking forward to it. I always look forward to the time I get to spend with James. We I think the business case or the business side of this story has had a lot of energy and interest from the group from week one of the webinar. So I'm sure some of the big questions are going to be answered today hopefully for the people who are tuning in and for people who watch it afterwards on recording as well.
Yes. And one of the things we're definitely going to talk about is various examples of circular economy as it is applied in businesses. And James, and maybe this is a good place to start. So what we noticed in previous weeks, whenever we talked about specific circular economy cases, there were a lot of questions and comments, almost trying to pick it apart and show that none of the examples are really circular. So the question to you, have you witnessed a 100% circular example out there today?
Wow, you haven't pulled any punches. Straight in hard, right? Yeah. So when I think about circular economic business models, and I was reading some of the chat earlier today actually on Slack, and there's a huge variety. And to pick up on Seb's point around systems thinking, I mean, there's very, when you get into the concept of circular economy, you can get very quickly lost in the complexity. And the challenge always is that with a complex challenge, there is always a simple solution that's always wrong. What you need to solve a complex challenge is a complex solution. And actually that takes time. And it takes time when you predicate that against the fact, the systems that we live in today, the businesses we see day to day in the world around us, in our global economies. So it's very hard to say at this stage on the 29th of April 2020, whether or not there are any pure 100% circular economic business models out there in absolute terms. Because ultimately this has to result in a system level change. So there are only bad choices in a bad system. There are only bad opportunities within a bad system. What you do get to see out there in the world now, and you have done for a number of years, you know, there are some examples that have been running for 20, 30, 40 years that haven't been called circular economy, but have applied circular economic principles to their very nature. What you do start to see now is more and more mainstream business, from the global brands that we know and love to some of the ones that we don't, adopting circular business models and adopting circular practices because actually it makes sense from a business perspective. And I'm sure one of the elements that we will get into over the course of this conversation is around the motivation of why businesses change from doing what they've done from a couple of hundred years across a couple of industrial revolutions to disrupting that path, disrupting that business model. I mean, in terms of specifics, sorry, Amar, you're going to try and interrupt me there. In terms of specifics, you know, you can talk about lots of really great organizations. IKEA, at the very largest stages around some of their innovation that they're doing, both at the local level, but both at the global level. But then also the kind of emerging innovators, the entrepreneurs out there that have circular economy at the heart of what they do, that are bringing circular economic business models and products to market at all levels of our global economies.
You've mentioned some pretty big names there, James, and you know it's not an uncommon question. I'm sure you get asked this all the time. You know, IKEA, Coca-Cola, Unilever, many people identify them as some of the biggest problems, or some of the greatest illustrations of a linear economy in action. Why do we work with those organizations?
Yeah, it's a question we get asked quite a lot, and for me it's really straightforward. If we look, let's take an example of, say, plastics, and let's use your example of Coca-Cola there, Seb. No one, not even Coca-Cola themselves, are blind to the challenge that we face around plastics across the globe. And no one is also blind to the fact that along that journey, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestle, you know, all of those large brands have been the largest protagonists in some of the situations that we find ourselves in now. I mean, Coke produced 30 million tons of plastic a year. That's a huge amount. But when you look at plastics as a challenge and look at a lot of the effort that we see at the moment, there's a lot of focus that goes on things like recycling, lots of focus that goes on for concepts like beach cleanups and ocean cleanups, things that we might describe as downstream solutions, dealing with that material once it's entered the environment. But what if you could come back to that system, that plastic system, and engage with the largest protagonists, the Coca-Colas, the PepsiCos, the Amcors of this world, and engage with them in such a way that you start to shift the way that system operates, so that when the three of us, with the people online, go out into the world and make choices, we can only make good choices because the system allows us to do so. So by bringing that challenge upstream, turning off the tap, as it were, stopping that material from leaching into the environment in the first place, that's how you start to drive systemic change. So businesses, who are the engines of our global economies, are critical in that broader system discussion.
So in other words, the big companies need to be part of the solution as well.
It won't be, it's not a shock. They're part of the problem, but they've also got to be part of the solution. But they're also not they're not the only element, which is why the work that the foundation does takes that big business component, which is really important. But also when we look at working with the governments and cities, with the policymakers and the legislators to create those right conditions for circular economic business models to grow. But then also the academia. How do we take people on that learning journey to help them understand why doing things differently and how they can do things differently is important?
A lot of people in the chat are picking up on that word collaboration, James.
It's got to be about collaboration. And for us, it's got to be a pre-competitive collaboration as well. And I think one of the questions I get asked fairly frequently, and my role is to talk to business externally and try and help them out. Firstly, trying to understand what their aspirations are around circular economy. And then with that information, trying to help them understand how they negotiate the foundation and the different programs and projects that we have and get involved. And one of the questions I get kind of put to me quite often is, come on, we're a big global conglomerate. We're a big global organization. We know everyone in our value chain. We know everyone in our system. Why do we need your help? And at times it's easy to be a bit flippant and say, well, if that's the case, why are you talking to us in the first place? There's something about that, being able to bring folks around a table, be they the largest organizations in the world or the most innovative, and everyone in between, and sit them around a table and say, actually, you're the folks who are the experts in your own industry. You're the ones who can solve this challenge. And we're going to bring you together and ask you to say, well, why haven't you done that? And what do you need? And what are the blockages? And who else needs to be in this conversation? So collaboration and pre-competitive collaboration is absolute when it comes to shifting the way we think about systems.
And it's also collaboration on different levels, because we need collaboration within the companies to break this functional silo so that people can come together and find innovative solutions. And then, as you say, pre-competitive collaboration between businesses and also collaboration among different industries as well. So various levels. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is the business case. And so when we approach companies and we start talking about the circular economy, how do we make the case for circular economy? And I want to share my screen and show just a few examples that I picked up from the Monday question challenge. So on Monday, we asked them in one sentence to describe the business case for the circular economy. And a lot of questions were around creating new value. So is that something that you would say makes a good business case for a circular economy?
For me, so there's almost two sides of the same argument here. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, we live in global economies that have been generated in a linear way for hundreds of years, a couple of industrial revolutions. So we can't expect to shift overnight to doing things in a different way. There's almost this linear lock-in, this legacy that we have to appreciate. So we need to understand that what is true in terms of value today might not be true tomorrow, but it is where we are today. So when a lot of organizations come to this, ultimately, it should be about identifying the fiscal component of a circular economy. There are clearly societal and environmental benefits to approaching challenges and products and services in a circular lens. But what we need to do in the short to medium term is to understand where that fiscal value can be unlocked.
And by fiscal, when you go monetary economic value, right?
Yeah, just by today's standards. And I think over the last 10 years, the foundation has been doing this. Very early on, we found that by going into a conventional boardroom and saying, if you don't do this, bad things will happen, that didn't resonate as well as if you said, if you take a circular approach, these are the new profit models you can drive. These are the better engagement mechanisms you can have with your consumers. And these are the flat markets where you can stimulate growth. Because right now, this shouldn't be an anti-growth agenda, but it should be a growth agenda that is restorative and regenerative by design, rather than the consumptive and extractive processes that we have available to us at the moment.
And that's something that we heard a lot as well, or when I read the answers, it was very common to see that the case for businesses would be the fact that the circular activities would enable them to have a positive environmental and social impact. So do you use that when you talk to businesses? Does it matter to businesses? Would it be the main argument, or the monetary value, economic value still remains the key?
You know, it's really funny. It's an interesting kind of position to sort of take. Part of that understanding what organizations' aspirations are is also about trying to unpick actually why is circular economy important to them. And fairly crudely, you could put organization into a number of buckets. There are those organizations out there, thank goodness, that see this as a way of doing things differently in the future and come to it based on the attitude to find a solution that allows them to do better in the world, be that in their own ecosystem or broadly across their supply and value chain. There are those that come to the conversation because there is a competitive element. Their competitors are doing it and they don't want to get left behind. And there are those that come to the conversation because actually they've realized that their business is not going to exist in a number of years' time if they carry on doing what they're doing at the moment, business as usual. They need to diversify. And for me personally, I'm a little bit ambivalent as to why they come to the conversation in the first place. Because for me, going back to that example of plastics and Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and those sorts of organizations, the fact that they come to the table, the fact that they engage with the conversation, the fact that they entertain a different way of doing things, that for me is the real value. And once they're at the table, once they're in that conversation, that's when you can start to shape thinking and help organizations understand the change they need to make.
And one of the things I have heard businesses say is that circular economy is future-proofing their businesses. So in order to survive, they cannot not consider circular economy. And
can I say I absolutely detest the expression future-proofing. I literally think the only way to the only way to future-proof yourself is just no longer exist, because that's the only way you can be proofed against whatever's coming in the future. Sorry, anyway, but I mean, like, I agree with the spirit of what you're saying, in the sense that it's about the long-term ambitions and how do we reflect on what we can businesses aren't blind to what's changing, and it's clear that they're going to have to operate differently in the future, not in a linear economy fashion.
And I wonder how many companies actually see just purely economic value in circular economy. And it's the last statement that kind of attracted my attention. Most simply, why make and sell two products when you can make one and sell it twice?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things around, and one of the things we talk about around a linear economy is that the underutilization of the stuff that we have in our global economies. This sort of take, make, waste economy, materials and resources in at the beginning, utility in the middle, and waste at the end. And by wasting, whether it be incineration or landfill, whatever you do at the end of that process, you lose all the labor costs, all the energy that's gone into making it, all the IP that's gone into making it. So if you can design a business model that allows you to capture that product back and either refurbish it, remanufacture it, or actually just sell it on to then secondary and tertiary markets, exactly that. You can then forecast on return based on this new model, because it takes X amount of dollars to produce, but you know how many returns you're going to get on an average life cycle of that product. So all of a sudden, this starts to become an economic argument. And you can see lots of examples of that out there in the world at the moment. It might not be called circular economy, but it applies that principle of designing for durability, designing for repair, designing for disassembly, and then allowing it to be reintroduced back into that system when the item or the product has been finished with in its first passage of life.
And this is actually a very nice segue to our next section. And if you have the question, Seb, I think we can go.
I do. I mean, I just want to reflect on a comment in the chat, Ilma, that Lara has requested James's face. Someone has said, can we go back to seeing James's face? So, you've got to give the people what they want. He's getting a lot of compliments in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think what James is beginning to talk about there is some of the business models that we want to cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. And we've put together this list of, like, there's lots of different ways in which you can categorize and break down business models. I don't think there's a necessary right or wrong. We've in the past, in some of our reports, you'll see something called the Resolve framework. We've taken these 5 from the OECD Circular Business Models framework. And actually, James, I think what you were just talking about there is this notion of product life extension models, which is effectively how do we extend and what Duncan, I think, in the Monday question was referring to, how do we actually extend the life of products? And that can be through designing them to be more durable. It can be through repair models, reuse models, remanufacturing. That must be one of the most common things you come across in terms of a business ambition. How do we actually get more out of this product?
Yeah, I guess I would say it's level pegging between that and sort of products as a service. And I think because there is, when you look again, go back to the complexity of what this means for a production process, for a value chain, those two examples are probably the easiest to grapple with straight away. And the images you've got here is obviously a car. We're talking there about remanufacture. Lots of examples there with the likes of Renault, who we've worked with for a long time, but also Volvo and VW, BMW. All the major automotive organizations for the last 15, 20 years have been looking at EV and AI. And part of that is around how they keep their product, their assets in circulation. It's something ridiculous, like a third of all global car production goes straight into leasing. Because actually, if I'm a car producer, manufacturer, what that gives me the opportunity to do is take a long-term view on where my material, the assets that I have on my balance sheet, are in the system and how much value I can get on return. Rather than someone buying a 25,000 euro car that depreciates over 5 to 6 years, I can keep that asset in the system and I can get 3, 4, 5, 6 cycles of utility out of it and get fiscal returns at the same level on each one of those cycles. When that vehicle is no longer in the condition that I need it for that particular market, I can then plan so that my product system allows that material to be disassembled, the plastic to be removed, the components to be removed, and then to be re-inputted into new versions of vehicles in the future. That then allows me to have that throughput system. But it's almost a closed system in terms of the material. You look at the image in the middle, phones. Apple have spent millions of dollars on disassembly robots, Daisy and Liam. Because actually, if I'm Apple, and let's say I make 100 iPhones a year, I'm pretty confident to know at the end of 12 months, my customers are going to want to give me those phones back because they want the latest model. Now, as a consumer, I can't, disassemble that iPhone. I can't get the value out of it. I don't want to either. What I want is to be able to make phone calls, FaceTime my friends, go on Instagram, go on the news, whatever it is. So I don't have the mechanism in order to capture that value when I want to get a new version. I just want to have the latest version that Apple are producing, or another provider. So if I'm Apple and I'm able to disassemble that iPhone at the end of 12 months, I retain the customer. And that's the first point, right? I retain the interaction with my consumer base. So I secure my future projections for returns on my company's growth. But within that device, okay, there's plastic and there's glass, but there's lithium, there's cadmium, there's aluminium, there's all these rare earth metals. All of a sudden, if I'm Apple, I can now safeguard my supply chain potentially against geopolitical or against rare earth metal commodity shock. So I'm also securing my future pipeline when I need to make that next generation of phones. So there are lots of examples, but I think someone in the chat earlier, it flashed up, Patagonia. Again, Patagonia have done a really great job on generating a secondhand market to the point where they've said, don't buy our new items, buy a secondhand item, buy a used item. If it's damaged, we'll help you repair it. If you can't repair it, send it back and we'll repair it for you.
What I'm hearing, James, is there's a huge, you could almost reel off anecdote after anecdote, example after example, especially and we've really just been focusing on a couple of those categories in some ways. That almost any product can be reimagined in terms of the system that it's in.
And that's the beauty. And it sounds a bit cheesy in some regards, but we designed this linear economic system that we have now. So there's nothing to stop us redesigning a new one. we are quite literally only limited by the extent of our imagination. There are some technological constraints there, but that's where design, digitalization of the world around us, new technologies and new material developments that help to identify and unlock some of these new business model opportunities that might not have been fiscally viable 6 or 12 months ago.
So I just want to draw back to these two business models we were talking about, product life extension model and product service system model, and maybe just emphasize the difference besides all the similarities that we talked about. And so in product service system model, most likely the company will retain the ownership of the product. While in product life extension model, the ownership goes with the user. However, the company, same company or a different company, can step in and benefit from an extra, oh, the slides have just changed.
That's okay.
Can benefit from the extra service provided to repair or service that item. For instance, repair workshops where you can bring your clothing items and then they create the new ones out of that, or they downcycle if it cannot be repaired anymore. And also before that, you were talking about underutilized items, which are just perfect to be utilized in sharing economy models. And maybe you could give some examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere, isn't it? You don't have to look too far. And we've reeled off a number of statistics over the years from things like office blocks to you know, the average car in Europe sits idle 22 hours a day, 92% of its time. Of the remaining 8%, about 1.5% of that is sat in traffic or looking for a space. And on average, despite having 4 seats, the journey takes 1.5 people. So for 22 hours a day, your car is sat idle. That 25,000 euro investment that you made to purchase that car in the first instance, that's a huge sunken cost in that asset. Hence why we've seen the rise of things like Uber, where and now with some of the advances around AI technology in the future, where people potentially, business models are being developed where people can potentially lease their car when they're not using it during the day. Now, there is a complexity here around ownership. There's a complexity here around insurance, the legalities of utility versus ownership. And these things also need to be worked out. But it's, again, there are so many opportunities to identify better utilization of stuff in the world around us. The key is just unlocking the right business model to do that.
I mean, so many questions coming through in the chat window and Q&A. We are trying to do a new thing, by the way. We're trying to answer as many of these questions, obviously live, and we've got James with us. We're also looking to use the forum space to come back to questions, because we do log all of these. You'll have seen, if you look at week 2 and week 1, that we've posted some answers to questions. So we are doing our best to give you the answers you want. Now, I wanted to pick up, there's a few that have come through. I can't see them all in front of me, but there's a few that have come through about the customer, the role of the customer. I think there was one from Claudia that said, how can we accelerate the adoption of circular economy among big companies? Consumer pressure, does that play a role? But I guess that, some sense of what's the role of the customer of this is a question that's come up a couple of times.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I think historically, our position, and it's kind of at the top of the conversation, is that there are only bad choices in a bad system. So as a consumer, how much power do you have as an individual to change the way the system around you operates? Now, that's a little bit flippant and it's a bit provocative, and I appreciate it, but let me try and explore it a bit further. When you look to change the system, you have to try and engage with the largest protagonist. And in order to do that, some people say, is this a ground up movement? Is it a top down? Is it in the middle? In reality, it's all of those things. We've seen really great examples of consumer need driving change. One of the key elements of that is the fashion industry. Our systemic initiative, Make Fashion Circular, that was the first systemic initiative where we took changing consumer trends as a driver of the industry. The recent international public backlash around major brands and processes around the fast fashion industry has created a huge amount of change. And ultimately, if you make good choices in your own life and influence those around you, eventually you get a spread. But fundamentally for me, you've got to change big business. You've got to get them on the right track. And then you've got to feed in all those elements to support in order to shift the way the system operates.
I'd tag something onto that as well, because I think you've made some good points. I've been looking into social science a little bit recently, and I've been reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And one of the things that illustrates is we actually always tend to overvalue our own ability to impact, or even if we're like working with someone on a project. If you're building a piece of IKEA furniture with someone and you ask people at the end of it, everyone always thinks they've contributed a bit more. And I think sometimes when I hear these questions about customers, when we look at those business models we were just talking about, the sharing economy, the product as a service, the product life extension, your decision whether to take part in that business model or not is probably not as thoughtful and thought out as you think. It's probably more driven by something like, is this quite convenient? Does this give me the product I want? Is it affordable to me? Much faster decision making than do I really buy into this philosophically or from like some higher level of thinking? And obviously, I guess businesses are very thoughtful about that in terms of, well, how do we get people to immediately identify this is a good value proposition for them?
And just to link it perhaps to yet another business model, which is circular supply model, which is how the company can rethink their supply for their products and make it come from renewable, regenerative, or already used materials. And very often, to close that loop, they need to engage their customers. So the relationship that the company has with the customer may need to change. So suddenly the customer becomes their supplier as well, and they need to establish these new links, which in a way engages the customer more, and it may make it more engaged and more loyal customer. But I've also heard quite a few companies say that it's not easy specifically to engage customers on the circular economy because there are certain attitudes about the used items, for instance. So used and green, it's not synonymous. So they may not associate the used item with something that is better for the planet. So they would go for something sustainable, ecological, ethical rather than used.
Yeah, it's always a really interesting thing. What is the driver? What is the semantics that you use? And I would always argue that whether it's circular, green, sustainable, ecological, whatever it is, it's got to be based on the right drivers, the right principles to drive that. When you look at things like consumer take back, do you incentivize, do you rely on people's good nature? I think there are two really huge components here, and I'm not a marketeer, and there are some very smart marketeers out there who make me buy things I don't need to buy and turn me away from things that I probably should buy. Is that emotional connection with stuff, and also the convenience. I'm sure, and this is a sweeping generalization, we've all been in those scenarios where despite having a keep cup or something like that, you found yourself on the way to work in a rush, and you've gone into a coffee outlet and you've bought a to-go coffee, despite having, keep cups at home, because it's been convenient. And when you look at things like leasing models, there are culturally, geographically, they don't always work in every geography, because there are different emotional connections to different things. There are different statuses and cultural links to different products and different things we see, which comes back to this idea around, for a complex challenge, you need a complex solution, because it's not one solution globally. It's probably 10 or 12 solutions to solve one challenge across different geographical limitations.
And an example here that also applies to this particular business model, circular supply model, could be T-Mill and the way they engage their customers and how they make it convenient for the customers to return the old t-shirts back to the factory. So there is this little label on each t-shirt, and you can get up to £5 credit. So there's incentive, and there is an easy way for the customer to do that. And also in some conversations I had with companies around circular economies, there is this sense amongst the companies that they also feel responsible for educating their customers, the consumers, about circular economy and the benefits of circular economy, which was quite interesting to hear. So maybe let's move to the last one with business model we haven't touched upon yet, which is resource recovery model, which is a lot about what can we make out of waste. which connects and ties quite interestingly with the discussions we had previously and how much we should focus on creating things out of waste versus designing out waste altogether. Any examples of companies that design things out of waste right now?
I mean, yeah, design out waste, don't design from waste. That's, you know, something we've been using for a little while now, and ultimately that should be the goal. Again, it's you know, for us as the foundation, we have a vision of what a circular economic future looks like. But we're not a consultancy. We don't own circular economy. We're trying to show a general direction of movement, a sort of North Star. It's down to the experts within their own organizations to understand the how. What does this physically mean for our processes? But there are stages along that journey that have to happen in order to realize that kind of Valhalla moment. How do we get to a circular economic globe? How do we get to the stage where the economy, the circular economy, is just called the economy? One of the really great examples around, and I prefer the term secondary resource to waste. Again, if we look at, you know, what we touched very heavily at the moment on the technical side of our butterfly diagram systems. We haven't really mentioned the biological. Waste doesn't exist in nature. Waste is a man-made component. Nothing is wasted. Everything moves in loops and cycles. Now, that's not to say that when a bird dies, it becomes another bird, but the nutrients in that system continue to feed the soil, the plant life, that then generate the environment to then create that ecosystem to allow that system to continue to function. There's a really great example in Denmark of a symbiotic business park, which has been running now for about 45 years. And it's just been happening because it made perfect economic sense. There are 8 different industries co-located, and I forget the name at the moment. It begins with a K.
Kalundborg.
Correct. Thank you, Seb. Kalundborg. And you've got organizations like BASF and Novo Nordisk and a number of others where they worked out that their waste streams from their commercial and industrial processes were feedstocks for the neighboring businesses. And over the course of 40 years, they've established this symbiotic commercial ecosystem where material flows from out the one process as feedstock into another. And and they don't call it circular economy, and nor should they. You shouldn't be putting labels over the top. It's just an example of great material movement and reclaim of waste that kind of exists out there in the world.
I have to say that, you know, like, obviously we've utilized these kind of 5 categories in OECD to make it simple. That category of resource recovery is the least convincing to me from the point of view that, you know, the Kalundborg thing is quite deliberate. It's quite designed. You know, they've considered the parts of the system. Then it's not just like, oh, what do you have going spare this week, or what's, you know, turned up in your tip? Can we use that? It's much more deliberate than that and by design. Whilst just this notion of like this, you know, if there's, you know, a situation where we can recover effective resources or materials or whatever it is to make new things, there had to be some design from the outset to make that possible.
Yeah, of course. And then they had to be geographically located so that you don't end up transporting that material over vast distances and then defeat the object. Another really great example I love is British Sugar, based in Norfolk, that probably about getting on for about 6 or 7 years ago, they turned sugarcane into sugar. And out of that process, they had 32 byproducts. And I think the anecdote goes, and I might be kind of applying a bit of poetic license here. The anecdote goes that they had a new chief of operations join, and he looked at the schematic of what they were doing, and they were trying to do resource efficiency saving. And they looked at every one of those products, and there was one of the schematics was just an arrow pointing to the atmosphere out of this funnel. He said, "What comes out of there?" And the response he got was CO2 and water. And some bright spark in the team said, "Well, we can probably do something with that." And they diverted that CO2, that moist CO2, and built some greenhouses and became one of the largest producers of tomatoes in the Norfolk region, which was just a byproduct. They then sold those tomatoes, which generated revenue. I now understand they grow medical grade marijuana because actually that has a greater fiscal return than tomatoes. But it's an idea of taking this kind of zoom out approach and saying, actually, we make a product, but what about everything else along that journey? And how do we valorize that waste stream, that secondary resource?
One thing I'm very happy to vouch for is the profitability of marijuana. I mean, that is unquestioned. There's a couple of questions that, well, we've got loads of questions. Just to clarify to people, we will share the OECD framework and some explanation and examples in the Slack channel afterwards. And so, you know, don't worry if you haven't been noting everything down, and we'll try and give you as many examples as we can. There's a few questions cropping up in the chat, James, about profitability. And I think that I have a couple of comments on it. Maybe first, that there's something intuitive in what we were just, for example, we were just describing about British Sugar and about some of these business models, like, you know, can you sell something twice rather than once? Intuitively, it makes sense that you get more money and better margins on some of these models. Obviously, when they're actually applied in detail, there's lots of nuance to every case. We at the foundation talk about this notion of the economic case, which is the kind of trillions of dollars of benefit. We talk about the business case, which is a sense of like what is good for a business, which, you know, is a broader question than just profits. And there's obviously this kind of short-term, especially short-term need to continue making profits. So what, you know, you must have loads of conversations with business about this. Where does profitability come into the conversation?
I guess for me, and similar to what we were saying earlier on in the conversation, it has to be key for this to work in the system we have right now and have to work in the long term. Because we've all seen really great work and really great initiatives that start based on the right direction and right ambition. But at the moment, unless they make fiscal sense, they don't stand the test of time. And what we're trying to do is break that linear system we have and point to the examples of where success is made, and then amplify that and bring others to bear. I guess, you know, and your point there, Seb, you know, the report, Wealth of Flows, this kind of $1.3 trillion opportunity in Europe is a huge figure, but doesn't talk necessarily to the specificity of what that means to an individual business. But it's got to be about identifying where the opportunity is for different growth, a restorative and regenerative growth, as I mentioned before. And that takes time to understand. It also takes a different kind of approach. This is not going to be the same sort of returns that we see at the end of month 1, month 3, quarter 2. It's going to be a longer term, because you're almost changing the way your business model operates. That's going to require investment, and it's going to need smart investment and patient investment. And that's actually a nice sort of segue to the work we're starting to do around the finance initiative within the foundation. Because one of the really challenging things when you take a circular economic lens is, what does good look like? How do you measure what good looks like? Is it diversion from landfill? Is it reduction in CO2? Is it reduction in energy? You know, what is the metric that you need to use? And that changes geography to geography, industry to industry, and product to product. One of the things we started looking at about 12 to 18 months ago was around capital investment, and seeing some really startling shifts of disinvestment from traditional oil and gas to those organizations and those opportunities that had clear sustainability objectives, circular strategies, that were starting to shift their business models towards a more circular economic version, and looking at where the opportunity for growth and success had happened. And our work with, our early work so far with BlackRock and Tesla Sao Paulo and a number of others is about been identifying those businesses who've taken the objective to become more circular and are actually now driving profit, be that money being diverted to new R&D projects, new products, circular products on the market, or clear profit that's being generated. And we're seeing a huge shift in the capital investment community. Folks who historically have not invested their money unless they think they can get a return. It started slow and it's starting to pick up. And the ambition, hopefully, is that that will continue in the direction. And you only have to talk to any business now compared to 12 to 18 months ago. All of them have circular economy and sustainability on their agenda. It might not be item number one, but it's on the agenda. And that's really encouraging. So at the moment, we have to focus in on how we drive our existing systems. And sadly, or otherwise, whatever your position is, that's based on profit and value. Hopefully in the future, the metric will be different, but that's the metric we have now. And in order to drive change, we need to bring that with us and then shape it as we go.
And I actually just wanted to ask you if you think that circular economy would require a different set of metrics, different set of performance indicators than we have right now within businesses.
Yeah, I would like to see a future whereby rather than say the Fortune Global 2000 is measured on share price based on the kind of intricacies they use there, actually it's made up of profit. It's made up of how a company collaborates pre-competitively with others, and it's made up around their social component within the communities they affect as well. But we're not there yet. So I'd like to see a shift and a change in the future. Someone's just mentioned, that triple bottom line example, exactly.
In capitals.
In capitals, yeah, I wasn't going to miss it. And this, we're starting to see pockets of this, right? But how do we make sure that those hotspots connect up? How do we make sure that momentum continues? And it's all those things we've discussed today: business models, consumer engagements, education, looking at new and innovative ways to disrupt the world around us.
So we are approaching the last, 8 minutes of the webinar. Any outstanding questions from you, Seb?
We could definitely grill James for a much longer period of time on this, but he's probably got another meeting to go to or something. But I guess, there's there's lots of cynicism, or not necessarily cynicism, but that whenever we talk about big corporates, those questions are popping up in the chat. They're popping up in the Q&A. When you're in, I think my final question to you would be, when you're in the conversations with sustainability manager from X big company, how much is that cynicism a factor, and what examples do you give them of sort of things they can aspire to, or what how does that conversation kind of go in that context where we're living in an environment where big brands aren't necessarily the most trusted organizations?
And
it's
realism.
Sorry, Emma.
Is it cynicism or realism?
I don't know. I don't know if it is cynicism or realism, or kind of acceptance. And I don't think we're ever naive. I don't think anyone is ever naive to think that when you're talking to a large global organization here, there are not elements of that same organization lobbying in the other direction over here. The challenge always comes about trying to. I love the idea, the analogy that IDEO use. Sometimes you need a bridge, and sometimes you need a beacon. Sometimes you need a project within an organization which shines a light on what is the potential of a circular economy. It might be a standalone project that actually just raises interest, makes a big noise about how a particular organization is doing something, which is really important at times. And other times you need something which is more of a bridge that's kind of baked into the foundations of how that organization operates. It's not quite as sexy, but actually it helps this kind of ground up. And part of the work we do with big businesses to help try and mitigate that, and there are two things. One that came online this year and one that we've always sort of done. And the latter of those two is helping organizations. The people we talk to generally are bought into the circular economic way of thinking. They understand, whether it be from a fiscal, social, or environmental perspective, that this is the direction that they're heading in. And they may sit at within a particular team, within a particular element within their business. The challenge for them is, how do they spread that belief that they have, or how do they spread that understanding of what a circular economy is across the organization? So we work closely with them, even down to the type of language you need to use when you talk to your CEO, your CFO, your head of marketing, your project managers, the guys and girls on the shop floor. Really encouragingly, I've seen we have a flurry of digital learning assets that we work with our big corporates. I'll give you one very specific example. Our C100 network has a digital learning asset which we give companies access to help them mobilize their own workforce. Historically, that's been about 50 licenses, right, for this particular asset. Target, large US FMCG, took that asset and made it a competency within the entire infrastructure of Target. So anyone who joined Target, anyone who was a member of staff, had to do that training, because unless their methodology was that unless their partners internally know why this is important, how do they then talk about how they're going to change their entire organization? And the other element we launched this year was Circulytics, which is around how do we help organizations measure what good looks like? And we launched our circular economy indices, our circular economy metric, which is an open source resource to give organizations the opportunity to take a snapshot of where they are on their circular economic journey. And in doing so, allow them to understand where they need to improve, where they need to go, and where they need to focus their resource. And then gives us an opportunity to have one-to-one conversations with our partners within our network to say, do you know, this hasn't improved over the last 12 months. How can we help you do that? How can we generate content to fill those gaps, those deltas, to help you raise your profile? So it's always a challenge between what is cynicism, what is hopefulness, what is just talking to the right individual who gets it, and actually helping organizations within that system start to shift and start to change.
Well, thank you very much, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you with us. So we have a couple of minutes just to wrap things up, and I'm going to share that slide with key announcement again.
Thank you everyone as well for all the questions and all the chat. We will continue to reflect on those. We've certainly tried to bombard James as much as we can, and we really appreciate him taking the time to answer. But thank you all for all your participation.
And James mentioned a couple of resources at the end, including Circulytics, and we will post the links to them on the Slack communities for week 3. And a couple of things that we want to say at the end. So first one is, as always, homework. So this week, as always, there will be 2 pieces of homework that we have for you. So one of them is going back to the systems mapping that you did last week. So we want you to return to these system maps. Think about that product in the middle of the system, and then think about which circular economy business model could be applied to make that product and the system that it is embedded in more circular. So you can post your answers either as an image or as a comment in week 3 Slack channel. So returning to the product that you created a system for, think about which of the 5 business models, circular business models, could be applied to make that product and its system more circular. So that's number 1. Do you want to say what is homework number 2 said?
Ilma, can I be honest with you? I have no idea what homework number 2 is.
It's the learning trios.
Oh, yes. Yes, great.
Trios.
So yeah, and we had great, I need to find the results of the poll and I'll share that in the group. But in general, lots of people saying how useful it has been to get together with 2 other people and reflect on these topics, reflect on the tasks. And we want you to do that again in week 3.
Yes. And you can do that on the Slack community, and you can see the link to the Slack community on the screen right now, as well as to the LinkedIn community. And next week's webinar will be on Wednesday as usual, and we'll be talking about the economy and next level of economy. And do you want to say anything about
the circular economy is just like a sandwich. To find out why, make sure you tune in at the same time next week. We're going to be joined by Ken Webster, author of Circular Economy Wealth of Flows. The circular economy is just like a sandwich, and every sandwich has 2 slices of bread.
And something in the middle. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next week.